That's why
And one example of trans truth in terms of historically, we've got the story of the Buddha doing a lecture and asked the audience of the people, what is the meaning of life? And everyone came up with all this different stuff or didn't know what to say. And one monk just stood up and held a flower. And that's the story. And the Buddha was like, yes. So that's a trans truth. It's like, something going on there beyond, this is a transcendent truth. It's kind of like in Zen, what's the sound of one hand clapping? These are pointers to a trans type of truth.
So that's a good example of that. But again, you won't see that often in media.
But there are examples of it in media.
There are things, tree of life. And also, as you mentioned, in the technology sphere, we're getting transpersonal technologies, which are things that are now beginning to merge biology and machines, which is happening more and more now, which we don't really know. AI seems like a trans tech. It's some kind of thing that's beyond, but they're all kind of still unsolved and undone at the moment.
Beautiful. All right, well, we're going to unpack this some more in the second part of the course, but for now.
Yep, for now we can move on and talk about some propaganda framing, because that's very important that we talked about framing and truth frames, but truth can be manipulated. So, and we can be manipulated. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit.
Beautiful. All right, so there's essentially 4 basic categories of propaganda framing techniques. Now, there's a lot of techniques out there. If you go to Wikipedia and you look under propaganda techniques, there's like 20, 30, 40. And if you look online, there's a lot of them. And some are very similar. But there are these 4 essential kind of categories that these all fit in. And so what these are is isolation framing, separation framing, projection framing, and distortion framing. Right? So isolation framing is oriented towards what's going on in the consciousness of the propaganda target. So when they target you for isolation framing, they're trying to change how you perceive the world itself. They're going for isolation. They're trying to isolate you inside your own consciousness. So things like trying to induce cognitive dissonance is a great example of isolation framing, because you're actually isolating yourself from certain kind of input information. And this is different than separation framing, which when you get isolated, you are being separated. Separation framing is targeting subgroups and separating them from each other and using like stereotyping and coded language and minority baiting, those kind of things to separate different subgroups. And then there is projection framing. Going back to the individual, projection framing isn't just going on as an internal process that they're trying to affect in you. They're trying to get you to project onto others. So to project any kind of blame or this or that, onto others. So they're trying to get you to transfer a blame onto somebody or some other group. Now, it could be a person, like through character assassination, or scapegoating an individual, or a collective group. So, like you can see, there's connections with all 4 types are overlapping, but the essential psychosocial mechanism is different. So in this one, projecting the enemy outside of you is fundamental to it. And then there is distortion framing, which is going on a lot right now in our world. And that is trying to induce chaos and confusion inside and outside. That's misinformation, disinformation, rewriting history, all of these things to distort reality and your sense of what's real. This is an essential part of the post-truth media sphere. And all four of these are happening simultaneously right now, very, very powerfully. So these are really important to understand. I recommend you go to the Wikipedia page and look at the different types and really familiarize yourself with them to help you kind of be more aware of when it's happening to you. We want to try to inoculate ourselves from this type of manipulation. And the best way to do that is to make them an object in our awareness. So once we understand what they're doing, we'll start to be able to pick it up.
So I'll note Hannah Arendt, who was a writer, wrote about the Nazis, actually had a great quote where she said, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist." So this is really covered nicely in these different frames. They're all ones that isolate you or separate you from others, or projection framing where you're projecting things onto others, often what you hate and fear the most in yourself, or the distortion framing where you are, just being confused with misinformation. And that's how you get these subjects. So that's why these are so important and so important to really understand, because the ideal subject for totalitarianism is the person who can no longer distinguish what's true and what's not.
And that's the key, is when this kind of authoritarian takeover happens, this is kind of the fundamental approach that they take to basically all four of these simultaneously to make us, not being able to tell what's going on.
Right. And whether or not propagandists know it or not, they are using the truth patterns that we described previously in the different structures to appeal to different types of people. Yeah. So subjective truth is very useful for one group of people, and objective truth is useful for another, or the manipulation of objective truth, or the manipulation of top-down authoritarian truth, So they are being used. We're not trying to bum you out here, but it's important to know about them.
Yeah, and these techniques are available online for everyone to understand and use. And right now, there is a war going on in the media sphere, and a lot of propaganda is going on, and we've entered a different kind of phase of the history of propaganda with the introduction of the big data and AI. The power of propaganda has now reached a level we've never seen in human history. The power to manipulate us is incredibly, incredibly advanced now.
Yep. And how can we fight back, Mark? Well, let's talk about big picture framing. So this is ways that we can reframe truths to find the bigger truths. And I know
now, this is the opposite of propaganda framing.
There you go.
All right, so propaganda framing is how can we manipulate the truth so that nobody realizes what's going on? How do we distort the truth? Well, big picture framing is how do we seek the bigger truths? How do we get to the bigger truths? Because those are really the best kind of truths to have to understand reality. So here we're going to start with, there are different levels of truth in terms of different frameworks we use for truth itself. And all those different forms of truth can be playing into here. And that is the subjective level, but that's, once again, going back to how we frame it. So this is not the big picture framing yet. So first level is the subjective level. How are we biasing and all that? So that is our, that is our self frame. Then there's the relational level. Now, how are we communicating with each other about this information and the truth, and how all of our different biases and all that, and what's the truth in this relational field? But again, that's not a big picture frame yet. And then the group level. How is a group perceiving a truth? Now, it's starting to get a little bit bigger, but it's still not getting to the big picture framing, because it's still just looking at a larger field, but it's still coming from the same perceptual construct field. So let me explain this further. All right, so then we go to the cultural level. What are the truths this cultural field is holding? And then the social level, like what are the truths that the society itself holds? And what's the frames, in the social system? And we could look at a situation from these levels. All right, so what's happening to me individually in this situation? What's happening to others individually I could think about? What's happening on the relational level here? So what's the relationships got to do with what's happening? Then we could look at the group level, like, so this is one group against another group, and what's happening there? Like, looking at it from this level, I get a certain kind of truth at that level. And then looking at, okay, how does cultural come into this? What's the cultural field around this, and how is that affecting what's happening and what's the truth? We're getting to the bigger picture yet, but we're still in the polarity field, okay? And then we get to the social level, okay? So what's the society framing around this event? So, if I am in the street at a protest, on either side, I could tell you the story and what's happening from a subjective level, or I could try to look at it from the relationships of what's going on between the people, or I could tell you what's going on between the two groups, or I could tell you what's going on between the different cultural fields that these groups are representing. And then I could also extend it to the social level, which is, well, what is going on in our society that is connected to all of this? What is this about? What am I protesting? And what's the issues and all this? So this is still all in the standard levels that we operate in the Western society. What I'm talking about is big picture framing goes beyond that at what we're calling the meta level. So what are our meta level frameworks? These are big picture frameworks where we start to get a more expansive and nuanced understanding of all of these at the same time. So it's an integrative kind of thing where all of these are part of it, but then we have a framing that unpacks it as a whole and finer tune it. So for example, what's going on in the United States right now, we could look at from all these levels. And then when we get to the meta level, there's 4 basic meta level frameworks that we can go to. The first one being what I call psychosocial systemic framework, which is still rooted in all of these, but gives it a frame, a bigger picture kind of frame. That's really true, but is not normally talked about in the media sphere. In some pockets, yes, but not in the general conversation. We call this the Overton window.
Right. So let's dig into that one a little bit. So you might have noticed, those listening, that all of these frames you're talking about, each one now transcends and includes the previous. So we're still talking about expanded frames of awareness until the meta level is the one where you're now seeing all of the other levels. And you have to be looking at all of those levels in order to really begin to understand them. So the psychosocial systemic framework, what can you dig into that a little bit and say what that means? Because we don't get too deep in the weeds. We want to make sure people can follow along.
The best example I could give you is using the fields like transdisciplinary fields like media psychology or media archaeology, in terms of, since we're talking about the media. These kind of frames look at what's happening from the media sphere perspective that includes the psychological, the social, and all that, but it's looking at it from the media sphere itself, right? And so you get kind of awareness is like when you're looking at this framework, you could really, there's a frame that could help us understand everything that's going on right now in the United States anyways, and in other countries. That is part of what many military experts around the world call nonlinear warfare. So at this level, we could look at what's going on as essentially we're in the middle of World War III. And what it is there's this new form of warfare called nonlinear warfare where propaganda tools are being used in new ways to disarm a whole society by creating chaos, confusion, and the discord inside of it. Turn them against each other, even their own families, and create a reality where nobody knows the truth, what's really true, and everyone's got their own truths and attacking each other for it. And there's so many different narratives that are being thrown into the media sphere during a non-linear war, which we are actually in from this frame, that no narrative can stick for a large group. Now, why this isn't important during an authoritarian shift is that one of the key ways of being able to stop an authoritarian takeover is a shared narrative, that when a population reaches a point of a shared narrative, shared enough by enough people, that collectively they revolt. And what they do in a nonlinear warfare approach is to make that impossible by giving you so many, bombarding you with narrative after narrative and weaponizing them outside of different fields. So it's a very complex thing, but basically we could look at everything that's happening in the United States and probably Great Britain, for sure, and other countries. And really, from the World War III nonlinear warfare framework, which is an actual framework in some military spheres as well, is that there is a war on democracies all over the world, a war on democracy itself. So, and we are in this war, and nonlinear warfare also means there's no single adversary. It's coming from multiple directions. So the nonlinear warfare frame is open source on the internet. So anybody could be using it. So anyway, so that's that level. But that is still, that's a big picture frame, but it's still in the polarization field.
The psychosocial systemic framework?
Yeah, I'm sorry. the
Yeah.
psychosocial systemic framework level, that is still in the polarization field. There is an enemy, there's war, there's an enemy, there's a battle, which is true, and it explains everything else, but it's also not big enough for us to actually transcend what's happening and make a shift. So then there is a systemic framework where we look at it from a systems perspective. So we look at things like interconnectedness, complexity, contextuality, nonlinear analysis. So we're looking at how the system of a civilization itself is functioning, how it's evolving. And we start to get into the evolutionary framework here, but not fully. But we start to kind of see how a society develops, understanding the forces of a system and the dynamics of a system. And we could look at everything that's happening from that perspective as well. If you listen to folks like Jordan Hall or Greenhall or Daniel
Schmachtenberger. Yep. Some of the people
they're coming at this from a
wisdom.
Right, rebel wisdom. They're coming at it from a systemic framework, but some of them are actually also bringing in the evolutionary framework, which is the next one.
So the evolutionary framework is another one of the meta level frameworks. We have the psychosocial systemic framework, and then the systemic framework, and now
then we get up to the evolutionary framework. And this is really kind of, you're bringing an evolutionary awareness to the situation and looking at it from all levels. So the evolution of the individuals, the evolution of the relational fields and groups and cultures and societies, you know, just the evolutionary flow up to this moment. And in a certain situation, kind of really sensing into that stream of evolution itself. And also to try to tap into more sensing of the evolving collective sphere, like the zeitgeist. What's the spirit of the times? You know, so there's a wider kind of field that goes beyond just social level understanding. But there's kind of like the zeitgeist is like as the spirit of the times, or the gestalt of a time period. And we try to tap into what is the direction of evolution itself in this situation, calling forth and calling us. This is called the evolutionary impulse. So to try to bring that awareness in to any situation, we can really start to unpack it in a much more expansive and deeper way. And then we have the meta-narrative framework. And that can be connected to any of these frames. It tends to integrate all of them. A meta-narrative is essentially, we start with an understanding that all human experience has a narrative quality to it. And what that means is that we are always framing everything in terms of a story, because our experience in this reality has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our life is a story itself. And so we look at everything and try to seek the story. So we're always seeking the narrative. What's happening in a situation, if we only have bits and pieces, we're trying to see what kind of a story fits those pieces. And we do this naturally. Understanding that, we could take that up to the meta level, which is, what is the bigger story here? Like, let me take all the pieces and see if I could find a meta narrative that includes all of this. So it's kind of like trying to find the meta theory, the meta story of what's going on. And the trick here, the beautiful thing is, there's a lot of power in a meta narrative. When we come from a meta narrative perspective, if it's a good one, we can really see the bigger picture and find clearer ways to act in response.
So let's give an example. An
I was
example
going
of
to
a
give you a
meta-narrative.
couple of examples.
The Great
One
Transition.
example is, and all of these are meta narratives that are resonant with a lot of people on the planet, and it's anchored in what's really happening. Okay,
And
so
archetypal, hopefully, as well. A good
archetypal as well.
narrative.
Yes, a meta narrative is archetypal, but it includes all the structures. So right now, one of the biggest meta narratives in the media sphere is that we are in the middle of a great evolutionary, civilization-wide transformation. And this incorporates systems theory, evolutionary framework, all of them. So basically, from this frame, we look at it and we could say that humanity is going through the largest transformation and transition in history. The next comparative transition was the Industrial Revolution. But this transition is exponentially more intense for many factors. And it's calling us to transcend our paradigms. Now, every major civilization-wide transition is grounded in a civilization-wide paradigm shift. And the structures of our whole society are transformed. Now, this goes to what Albert Einstein was talking about when he basically said that we cannot solve a problem from the consciousness that created it. So humanity goes through these cycles, through these stages of development, and we reach points as a civilization where we've created problems that we can't solve at the stage we're at. So we have to make a leap in perception, a leap in our paradigms, a leap in our technologies. Now, often it's triggered by a few people who make the leap in consciousness, who create technologies that then help us, nudge us. But so the Industrial Revolution was from the mythic feudal period to the rational industrial period. And that's a single shift.
One stage of development.
One stage of development to the next. What we're going through is multiple stages in multiple domains of civilization at different levels at the same time.
At an accelerating pace as well.
At an accelerating pace.
The pace of everything is accelerating. So it's
basically from this frame, every problem we have is a problem of consciousness, and that problem of consciousness comes from the gap between the leading edge of our technologies and the lowest structure of consciousness that has political power in the civilization. And that gap right now is 5 stages apart. 4 to 5 stages, depending on where you're looking. And that's the big transition we're asked to make here.
Right, and you were mentioning how technologists sometimes will move the culture forward by creating a technology that is at another stage. So certainly the move to the rational structure, the industrial structure. When machines came in, all the people who were using horses and plows, their whole structure shifted. That's when objectivity and rational thought sort of really came online in a big way, because it was like embedded into the technologies that people were using. Right. And it's also worth noting, though, that we have that great quote from Terence McKenna where he talked about the soul of the artist is to, the task of the artist is to save the soul of humanity. Anything else is just fiddling while Rome burns. So when we talk about media makers as well, this is why it's such an imperative right now as a media maker to begin to understand these shifts and to begin to work to help create that meta-narrative. So artists and media makers create the meta-narratives, hopefully, or help create them, because
so this
you can't become what you haven't seen.
This meta-narrative is very important for media shamans to understand. We're getting into the media shaman zone. Now remember, if you understand shamanism, or you know the history of it or whatever, that a lot of shamanic processes is in narrative form. Storytelling is an essential thing. Rituals is a narrative process, the vision quest. So there's a lot of, story is essential to how we heal each other. And so this frame is an important frame, a meta frame. The other one, which is key, is what I call the collective self frame. Now, this really becomes meta, but it's based on science. So if you look at our reality, ourself and each other and humanity, and individually, each of us, we appear to be separate beings at the physical level. Our bodies are separate. But actually, when we get down into the molecular level, there's no separateness. There's just different vibrating frequencies in an ocean of molecules. And then we go quantum level and all that, and atomic and quantum level. Basically, from the molecular level down, there is no separation. And now, if neurophysicists are correct, they are exploring that consciousness is a quantum phenomenon. If that is correct, that means that consciousness transcends time and space. So if we come from this perspective, we could look at each of us as one cell inside of a collective self. And now, if we use that frame to look at what's going on and look here and say, what is happening right now? How do I look at this from the collective self? And one of the things we do in our process is we look for collective exposure therapy framing. So when we learn and grow, we often learn and grow through trauma. And there's a form of therapy called exposure therapy, where you introduce someone to the thing that is challenging for them, to get kind of exposure to it over and over again.
Like someone who's scared of snakes goes in a room full of snakes. And
right, that kind of thing. And so if we realize that the collective self evolves through the stages as well, and how it learns through exposure therapy. So how do we look at a given situation and say, how is this exposure therapy? Now, for example, we connect this to the Great Transition as well, because as our collective beingness goes through this transition, we have to face our shadow material individually and collectively. So, for example, in the United States, we could look at, for example, a lot of people who are perceiving that President Trump is an authoritarian in the middle of an authoritarian takeover from that frame. But if we look at it from the collective self perspective within the Great Transition, it's very profound to look at this and go, perhaps he is a manifestation of the American shadow, our cultural shadow. And so how do we then hold him from that frame? Is very interesting. I'm not saying, what I'm saying is how we hold these frames can give us different perspectives and different understandings.
There's a very valuable concept out of spiral dynamics, which is another system of meta theory similar to integral theory, a little bit different, but one of their concepts is that sometimes you have to go backwards on the spiral before you can go forwards because there's a spiral. So having Donald Trump come into power and prominence was a necessary step because America has a lot of shadow material. One of the ones that a lot of people really note is, of course, our shadow material around slavery and race and sort of ongoing historical wound. And that one, of course, because we never dealt with it properly, it keeps coming back up, you know, in these forms. And now it seems to be coming up much stronger, probably because of Donald Trump and that shadow that's been brought to the surface. And so now suddenly it's all coming up. But as you say, this has to happen. So the job of the artist is to help shepherd the culture through this, or the job of media makers. And even if you're just posting to Facebook, if you have that frame that you're helping to shepherd people through the darkness into the light, that's a very useful perceptual frame as well.
Right. So we could say that the evolutionary and meta-narrative framework are basically shamanic framings, media shamanic training framings that we can use, because they're really oriented towards this transformation aspect, this evolutionary transformational kind of framing, which is what shamanism is all about, is we are here to help ourselves and each other evolve. And
right. So
that
now,
really helps.
Right. So now we've taken kind of a pretty deep dive into different kinds of truth, and I know it's been some heavy going.
In terms of the shadow, right now in the United States, there's not just the shadow that I just talked about is Donald Trump a manifestation of the American shadow, but there's also on the right, on the left, there's also a lot of shadow material coming up. So, you know, for example, cancel culture has reached a point of that it's become pathological. And that is, it's like, so what is the shadow coming up from? So right now, every cultural field, at least in the United States, and I'm suspecting all over the world, is experiencing shadow material coming forth. And it's calling up our shadow material. And so that is kind of, we cannot cross over the big transition with all of that shadow baggage. So we have to let it go. But before we can let it go, what the problem has been is, what the shadow is things that we have ignored or denied or buried. We haven't really faced it honestly and really kind of heard the lesson and got the lesson. And so we have to learn these lessons before we could get to the other side. And real quick, I wanted to just use the metaphor that's the classic here. Right now, especially in the United States, we're in what anthropologists call the liminal phase. When a civilization-wide shift happens, the old systems start to deconstruct. And those systems become pathological because they're trying to hold on, to keep itself stable. And what that means is people in those systems don't realize it, but they are operating out of the system paradigm. They're caught inside of it. So people start freaking out and all this. This is kind of like the deconstruction is the beginning phase. Now, when we look at the caterpillar going into the butterfly, anthropologists use this metaphor a lot, because first the caterpillar's body dissolves once it's in the cocoon. into pure liquid. This is called the liminal phase, when the old structures have dissolved and the new ones have not emerged. So we are in the middle of, we are in the beginning phase of the liminal phase, where our systems are basically deconstructing around us. You know, how, you know, media, the old form of media, which is centralized distribution of information from a centralized source out to us, that's collapsed. That's gone. The idea of what the truth is, gone. So all of these things have collapsed. Our political system is deconstructing. The pandemic has made us aware of the fragility of our infrastructure and things that we didn't even think about.
And the pandemic, I think, has greatly improved people's sense of systems and interconnected systems and even meta systems, because people are realizing that all these different systems that seemed like they were separate from one another, like the medical system, the political system, the educational system, the system.
Again, when we look at the pandemic as a form of exposure therapy and start thinking about what's the lessons here, what do we have, you know, that helps us really kind of deepen and expand our understanding of what's going on. So that's kind of the key. So that's what I wanted to really kind of focus here at the end, is that these meta frames, these meta narratives can really help us see the bigger picture. And that is vital, because in the moment that we're in, the only thing that's going to help us is the meta narrative level, because the media war that we are in, World War III, the nonlinear war that we're in, has created a media sphere where everything has been weaponized against itself at every level except the meta level. So our only shot in terms of the current atmosphere of the media sphere is to come at it from the meta level.
Step outside.
It's the only one that's not been weaponized.
Right, all of the tribal. So which kind of brings us to this issue of sense making, which is, how do we make sense? How do we figure out what's real and what's not? And I know we're going to talk about this from the individual level and the collective level, sense making. So let's get to it. How do we make sense of the world at the individual level? Mark, what do you got for us?
All right, well, a very simple way to do this is, so what are the steps I need to take when I'm receiving information for me to really upgrade my sense-making capacity? Now, as we talked about, the old sense-making system has been deconstructed. We can no longer depend on these centralized sources. And we now understand that every source is biased. So a real simple thing is to go through these 5 steps in your head. Self-frame awareness. All right, let me reflect on how I'm receiving this. What are my frames of receiving this information? All right, let me look at this information and try to like perceive what are its frames, like what does it include, but what is excluded, right? And then ask yourself, what's the source of this information? And what is their biases? And that source, what is the environment that they are in? And what is the bias of their organization or culture? And then look at this information from different collective frames. So go outside of your reality bubble and look up. If you're on the right, look at what they're saying on the left, and vice versa. If you're on the left, look at what they're saying on the right. And then look at other dimensions, not just left, right, but as many as you can find to get to weave a bigger picture, and even bringing in the bigger picture frames here, the collective framing. That is all great, and try to do that, and then try to integrate it and see if you could feel into what is most likely happening here. Now here's the trick. This in and of itself will not do it, because now this is important for us to do these kind of practices every day, but this is not the end of our sense-making process. And the reason is the world has become so complex. The media sphere is so fragmented. And this media war has polarized the field so intensely that it's impossible for an individual themselves to really make accurate sense of what's going on. And the reason why this is happening from the evolutionary collective self level is that the leap we are being called to make includes a shift in our sense-making capacities. So instead of depending on a centralized source of information, we have to seek it collectively. So then we have to bring in our individual practice into a collective sense-making environment. What that looks like is we need a group of people that we could go to when something happens, that we could check in with and see the different perspectives, but also to be capable of working together in an unfolding situation to understand it. So now the basics of creating a sense-making collective, that this could be a small group or a big group or whatever, it's how to make sense of the world at the collective level. There's certain procedures and ways of being that are important. The first one is to have a shared intentional field. And that intentional field for a sense-making collective is we are here, all of us are committed to looking at our own biases, to looking at the other biases, to really seeking the best understanding we can, and to evolve into the best sense-making instruments that we can, and not to get caught in polarization. So that kind of shared intentional field is required for the field. And what helps a sense-making field is diversity of members. So if you have all people at the same worldview, the same economic level, you have all men or all women, or you want to diversify as diverse a field as you can. Because what you want to do is, if you have a car accident with 10 different perspectives, you want to make sure you have all the different angles into the field. And again, everyone needs to be committed to both their inner sense-making practices and the outer one. And then also, we have to work on having generative conversation framework. Now, what generative conversation is it's not adversarial, it's not debate. What it is that we're each trying to really listen to each other and reflect back to each other what we're perceiving of each other, and trying to create this genuine open field where we're discussing and we're searching for the truth together without our constructs. We're trying to generate an understanding between us. Now, what this means for a one-to-one conversation and what it means for a group is very similar. Basically, you're trying to create a collective field that learns. What collective intelligence means is that a collective of individuals have reached a point where the actual collective field itself learns and grows and evolves. And discoveries will come up in the field that emerged not from a single person, but from bits and pieces of everybody's contributions. Suddenly there's a collective, aha, you've just created a collective intelligence field process. And so out of that generative conversation framework, we can get into the collective intelligence field awareness, where how do we sense into that field? How do we work with that field? And that, we could break that down to being aware of the field between us at the group level, then at the zeitgeist level, the bigger collective, then at the evolutionary level, the bigger perspective of what's around us and the force of all of us through time. And then the collective self is the biggest one here. But the collective intelligence field awareness tries to include them all.
So we're getting into an interesting terrain here, because we're sort of saying that to be a media shaman, you can't be alone at the edge of the forest, but you have to actually join with others, because what will save us is collective intelligence. I know we're getting a little bit probably far out for a lot of people, but it's something to, I was mentioning this book I just read recently called Stranger Than We Can Imagine, which is sort of a history of the 20th century. And one of the points he makes is that with relativity came online, then it became the age of the individual. So the 20th century was all about the individual, because we realized that individual perspective was all we had. There is no truth outside of that. But the individual perspective, of course, has problems as well, because then suddenly everyone's fragmented. So now we're calling for people to think more in a collective way, as society, as cultures, as nations, as even all the people on Earth, forming one collective.
Now this is a great point. This brings us back to the big picture perspective of the Great Transition. That the transition we're being called to make, according to meta theorists and systems theorists and evolutionary biologists, is essentially a shift from a nation-centric paradigm to a global-centric paradigm. And we're being called, humanity is being called for the first time to transcend our us-them patterning. And that is one of the greatest challenges we've ever faced. That's why all this shadow material is coming up around the polarization field now.
Because a lot of people have already transitioned beyond it in a way. A lot of the, especially younger people, there's sort of a sense that young students in America understand that young students in Iran and young students in Egypt and young students in Sudan, we're all fighting the same fight for autonomy and for a collective that takes care of the whole. And we have problems that can no longer be solved from the nation state perspective, climate change being, certainly one of the major examples. You can't solve them from a nation state.
And one of the keys here is that these young people who grew up on the internet and smartphones, they naturally have less of the polarization field inside of them. And they have an innate collective intelligence capacity. Now, when you watch a bunch of these kids playing together in Minecraft, and if you watch, a group of kids around the world teaming up to create a world inside of the Minecraft system, they automatically create this collective intelligence sense-making field where they almost can read each other's mind. Oh yeah, here, oh yeah, that, and they work. It's not just multitasking, but they're kind of doing things in a way that one feeds off the other, feeds off the other, feeds off the other, without a lot of conversation.
Or hierarchical bureaucracy.
No, it's a decentralized field. And that's one of the other things, is we're where part of this transition is from centralization to decentralization. So all of these things are part of the transition. So when we look at what's going on in the economy and all that, and we got the emergence of like cyber currency, which is a form of the decentralized currency. And so we've got the internet, which is a form of decentralized, so it's like we are being called into this form of sense making, that the natural new consciousness that Einstein is talking about for this particular period, we need to shift into a collective sense-making capacity. That is, in terms of sense-making, that's where we need to go in order to make the leap.
And we will, in fact, give you many of the tools in part 2 of this course. We're going to go over some of the specific